Center for the Ethiopian Educational Information and Communication Technology presents Educational Satellite Television Programs.
Hello, teacher. Hello, students. Welcome to today's lesson on the history of the struggle of the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia against oppression. This is our second lesson on this topic. Last time, we learned about 3 examples of peasant uprisings in Ethiopia. We learned about the negative consequences of inequality, oppression, and violence. As the government committed more unjust acts against the peasants, such as raising their taxes or forcing them to leave their land, the peasants responded rebelliously. In this lesson, we will continue to talk about the history of oppression in Ethiopia. We will focus on the outbreak of the Ethiopian Revolution. Students, let us get started right away with a short activity question. Why is it necessary to study the history of oppression in Ethiopia in our civics class? Please answer this question in full sentences.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up. Let's get back to our lesson.
Thank you, students. Civics is the study of citizenship. It is the study of the role of government and of the roles and responsibilities of citizens. In other words, civics helps us to understand what it means to be a citizen. Part of this knowledge is historical. We must understand how the country has been governed in the past in order to understand fully how it is governed in the present. Historical knowledge helps us to understand the benefits of democracy, and this understanding will help democracy to become deep-rooted so that Ethiopia can move into a better future. Students, do you remember the 3 historical peasant rebellions that we discussed last time? Please take a few minutes now to identify what they were, what caused them, and what the results were. You may begin whenever you are ready.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up! Let's get back to our lesson.
Well done, students. Let us review your answers now. In chronological order, the peasant uprisings we discussed in our last lesson were the First Wayoni Movement of Tigray in 1941, the Gojam Peasant Struggle in 1968, and the Bale Peasant Struggle, which took place between 1963 and 1970. The First Wayoni Movement was caused by administrative inefficiency, corruption, and the greed of the army. The rebels had some victories at first, taking several towns, but eventually the government crushed the rebellion with the help of British forces. The Gojam peasants' struggle was provoked by the government's attempt to increase taxes in order to erect a statue of the emperor. The peasants petitioned the government, but the government did not respond positively and sent the police and army to suppress the peasants. The Bale peasant struggle was caused by an increase in land taxes and by the forced resettlement of Christians in a Muslim region. The government regained control through brutality. We will now turn our attention to the outbreak of the Ethiopian Revolution. The revolution did not happen unexpectedly. It did not erupt in sudden violence. Rather, it was the consequence of a growing discontent among the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. Ethiopians were increasingly dissatisfied with the government, and the revolution was the consequence of their opposition. Tension and opposition to the government was fueled by discontent among students and soldiers. The students became agitated after the famine in Wollo province in 1973. This famine resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. The students began to react to the injustice and inequality that had caused the famine. The soldiers began to protest in 1974 about lack of food, water, pay, and about poor conditions. Mutinies and revolts spread throughout the army and air force. The emperor responded by increasing pay and firing some officers. At the same time as the mutinies took place in the army, students were demonstrating and protesting in Addis Ababa over educational reform plans. Teachers demanded higher pay. In addition, the Arab-Israeli war had caused an energy crisis. Fuel prices across the world had increased, and taxi drivers in Ethiopia went on strike. Despite the emperor's attempt to pacify protesters and suggest some reforms, the strikes, demonstrations, and protests continued and grew. The government did not respond to the revolution by considering serious reform. This was the only way that the peoples of Ethiopia would be satisfied. They had suffered oppression in various forms for too long. Because so many protests happened at the same time, the revolution gained force. Instead of seriously reforming its policies, the government sent the army to deal with the various protests. Within the armed forces, there was a group of officers called the Derg. They formed a military committee, and they worked slowly and steadily to break down the imperial government. They also aimed to overthrow the emperor's own institutions and to dethrone the emperor. Finally, they succeeded, and Emperor Haile Selassie and his family were imprisoned. His advisors were also captured and sent to prison. The Derg then took control of military power and established its own regime. It did not bring democracy to the country, but rather it ruled with unlimited power and established a single-party system. The struggles were not over for the peoples of Ethiopia. Students, this is the end of our second lesson on the history of oppression in Ethiopia. Today, we have focused on the outbreak of the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, focusing on some of the reasons for the people's discontent with the imperial government. Next time, we will learn about the Second Wayoni movement, the struggle against the Derg, and Ethiopia's transition to democratic rule. Until then, thank you, teacher. Thank you, students.